千里之行，始于足下. A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we take a deep dive into the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. As always, I want to extend my welcome to you. Thank you for joining us. I would like to invite you to center your thoughts and direct your attention to this moment in time, to the here and now, to be fully present and mindfully aware as we are ready ourselves for this sacred process in the Tao with one another. So this is depicting the sage observing nature. There's the mountain in the distance, there's a forest nearby. The observations of the sages. This is the slide that I want to use to graphically summarize what we have talked about. They look at nature, they note that the Tao creates, sustains, and provides for all living things, and yet has no need to control any of them. This is different from the concept behind many deities that we know in human cultures. There are times when mythology and religious figures will say that the deity wants to control the world. There are also times when the religious teaching is that the deity wants to let people choose for themselves. So what the sages observe in nature is definitely closer to the latter, that the deity, nature, is leaving it up to individual human beings to make up their minds about what to do. Nature, the Tao, is not imposing any mandates as to what to do. So they're similar in that way. Second point, the Tao is effortless in its functions. It doesn't expend a lot of effort the way that human beings do when we are trying to accomplish something that's a highly desirable goal. We're very stressed because we put in so much effort and energy. The Tao, nature itself, is always without the exertion of strife or struggle. But the Tao always succeeds in the end. The Tao wins out in the long run. Noting this, the sages compare that to what they see among human beings. They see that when people suffer from fears and anxieties, they often try to control everything and everyone. This is the exact opposite of what nature does. So this is something that's of special interest to the sages. Then, in terms of success or failure, the sages also note that most people struggle for more and more control, but still end up with more and more failures, like the opposite of what they want. Then, out of this, the sages conclude we can all live a lot better by being closer to nature than most people. We can also live our lives in that effortless way, not trying to control anyone, being harmonious with everybody, and have a much better life, a much more successful life by any metric, by any measurement. In this slide, you can see that line 12, the sages do not control. Line 13, the sages do not possess. Line 14, the sages do not presume. So I want to bring those together in one slide, graphically summarizing them. The way of the sages, and remember, this is due to their observation of nature. The way of the sage is not controlling. The sages recognize fears. We talked about the fear of abandonment, the fear of betrayal, fearing the loss of control, fearing failure. They recognize these fears for what they are. The sages and Tao cultivators, in their moments of sagehood, they can see right through these fears and recognize that these fears are illusory. They are as temporary, as transient as the things that they're based on. If you fear losing material wealth, well, material wealth is transient. It's an illusory fear. Then, as the fears vanish, the associated anxieties also vanish. Hence, the sages have no urge to control anyone because they do not suffer from the fears or the anxieties associated with the fears. The way of the sage is also not being possessive. This is particularly true in terms of relationships with people. If you set them free, the sages believe, and they come back to you, then you know you have created this unbreakable bond of friendship that cannot be seen, and yet it is powerful, it is strong, it is based on mutual trust and respect. So, in other words, if we look at where we are right now, we're all engaged in this meeting. There is a bond among us. There is the connections that we all share. If that bond is strong, people come back again and again, even though they're not being forced to do so. So there's no way and no need to be possessive. The better way is to let go, to set them free. And lastly, the way of the sage is not presumptuous. And as I mentioned, there's a couple of aspects to this. I want to make sure that we cover them both. One is the presumption of superiority. The sages should not have any of that presumption, even though they may know the Tao better than most. The understanding, the insight is that, well, I may do well in certain things, but certainly not everything. Therefore, any feelings of superiority would be unfounded, not having a foundation in reality. Second, there is the presumption of certitude. What do I mean by that? By certitude, I mean righteousness, correctness, propriety. We definitely see this all the time now in our world, where people come into a situation feeling a lot of certitude about what they believe in, and they are not ready or willing to listen to any other perspective. The sages understand that what is right for me may not be right for someone else. The sages are self-possessed, so they have a very good idea what is right and proper and correct for themselves. Usually, they arrive at those conclusions very thoughtfully, and therefore, those opinions are not likely to change. It's something that they forged over time based on objective evidence from reality. But at the same time, They do not have the presumption of certitude in that they will not try to impose what they believe onto someone else. If other people are ready and receptive, they want to listen, then great. The sage will explain exactly how he or she feels about a particular topic. But if people are not ready to listen, it's just as well. The sages will just move on. So these are the three primary components in the way of the sage. Observations of the sage of the flowing river. As we have seen, the river flows across the land, nourishing everything it encounters. We definitely get that. We can see, every time we see a river, we see that happening. The river keeps flowing, does not stick around to dwell on its success. It just keeps going. It doesn't stick around. Then this success lasts as long as the myriad things continue to flourish. It's best to understand this final point by talking about what happens if the river stays in a particular place to dwell on its success. What if this is not the case? What if the water flows to a particular place and stops? The myriad things have taken the water, success attained. But then what if the water then doesn't move on? Well, that's exactly the metaphor that is used to depict water that has become stagnant and stale. We definitely see this occasionally when we hike across the forest. We can see pools of water that have gathered, but it is not part of a flowing stream. It's just sitting there. It has become stale. It's stagnant. It can fester because it is no longer fresh water. Now, in your hike in that forest, do you dip your cup into the stagnant water to take a drink from it? That would not be advisable because the stagnant water has become unfit to drink. So the success that the water had upon initial arrival, when it was still fresh and can be nourishing, that success no longer exists. It is not a success that lasts. So that success initially has become stale. And that is the point that I wanted to make with this particular graphic. It makes it clear that in order to continue the success, you must remain dynamic. Continue to live and move, take action in accordance with the Tao, and not stick around to dwell on anything. Now, we have seen the sages exemplifying the Tao in multiple ways now. And we have seen how it's tied together from the beginning of this chapter to now, to the end. We can now tie together everything, all the concepts, in order to summarize what we have learned from this chapter. I've put a table together here. I want to point out that the two columns that you see on the right, the center column and the rightmost column, these are the complementary dualities. You can see the attractive and unattractive. This is referenced in line 1 of this chapter. In line 2 of this chapter, we get to the good, the kind, the not so good, the unkind. In other words, the positive and the negative. So that's another complementary pair. To the left-hand side, the leftmost column, I have references from the chapter itself. So the first row is the first line, when the world knows beauty as beauty. That gives rise to the yin and yang of that which is beautiful and that which is unattractive. The second line, the second row that you see there, when the world knows good as good, that gives rise to the duality of better, worse, better or worse, positive or negative. Then we can talk about the characteristics that we have seen. The third row talks about the sages not controlling, that the sages create but do not possess. The next row down below, the sages do not presume and they do not dwell on success. So let's talk about how we can apply that in reference to the complementary dualities. As we talked about, the sages have no need to control anyone, only themselves. So we can learn from that as well. Why do we need to control anybody or anything? We have to focus on refining, improving self-control, self-discipline, living by that personal code of honor, not be inconsistent in thoughts and actions. So that's the positive aspect of it. The column here under the attractive, you can think of it as characteristics of a beautiful soul, the soul of a refined, advanced Tao cultivator. Whereas the column on the right is going to be the unattractive, the things to be careful of. The complement of having no need to control anybody is having the need to control everything. So a lot of people may be fearful and therefore anxious and controlling. That's unattractive. That's negative. Let's talk about being possessive. Whatever the sages have created or nurtured, they will set free. That's attractive. It's a kindness to let things go, to let them spread their wings. The complement to that, unattractive, very unattractive. People that don't know the Tao may hold on to relationships and things with a death grip. So this is a kind of unattractiveness we all recognize. Sometimes we don't see it in ourselves, but we can see it in other people better. And this is why you oftentimes will hear people say, hey, look, listen, you got to let that go. Let it go. And that's because so many people, so many of us have this tendency to just hang on, to grasp onto things and refuse to let go. Here, you can see that it's negative and unattractive. Let's talk about being presumptuous. Even before we get into it, you already know arrogance is not attractive. We all know that. We've all seen that. But being humble can be very attractive. Someone who's down to earth, self-deprecating, exhibits humility without self-degradation, is humorous in the self-deprecating humor, that person can be rather attractive. No arrogant presumptions. That's positive. So, like I said, the opposite, the arrogance, very unattractive. So the people who don't know the Tao may be lacking in humility. I would even apply that to us because we have moments of being arrogant or being driven by the ego, make presumptions that we presume. We forget the teachings of humility. So this right here, I'm hoping, is a reminder for all of us, myself included, how to be more attractive, how to avoid the unattractive in ourselves. So far, you have seen that It is much, much more attractive if we avoid being controlling, if we avoid holding on to things, refusing to let go, and if we avoid being arrogant. So lastly, it is positive and attractive to not dwell on success. Sages achieve a particular goal, move on to the next one, like the river, like nature itself. When we see the changes of the seasons, upon the completion of that change, nature immediately moves on to do the work of that particular season. The unattractive aspect of it, yes, people dwell on past glories. They remain stagnant in the present. So this is sort of like when you hear people talk about what they did before. Back in high school, I did so and so. Back in college, I was big man on campus. How attractive is that? It is not. So what we want to do is to watch all this and use this particular slide as a guide. So our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.